We'd love to invite you to ruminate for a moment on the theme of this morning's plenary, which is passing the torch. Last night we heard from innovative young changemakers, and this morning we're looking at the conversations between people that we would consider our mentors, the people who've walked the path before us, and our generation as we step in to carry that torch. So next we're going to invite the wonderful Steven Olikara from the Millennium Action Project to be in conversation with two leaders from a local state level. As we think about our world in 2016 and in 2017, it's easy to look beyond the borders of the US, or it's easy to look at the federal government. But where we're really seeing change happen fastest is at the local level and the state level. And I'm hearing more and more from Nexus members getting involved in their city and state governments. And so we're really excited to have Steven be in conversation with two leaders from Ohio, Frank LaRose, who is an Ohio State Senator, as well as Capri Cafaro, who was an Ohio State Minority Leader. So welcome to Frank, Capri, and Steven.
Guys, thank you. How are we feeling? Excellent, excellent. A lot of familiar faces in the audience. Thank you. Well, I'm honored to be here. My name is Steven Olikara. I'm the co-founder and president of the Millennial Action Project. I'm thrilled to be with my dear friends at Nexus, Jonah, Rachel, dear friends. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I often say that Nexus and the Millennial Action Project are sister organizations, not only because Nexus is organizing young philanthropists while we organize young legislators, but we physically were birthed from the same office. And if any of you know Jonah, I had the chance to share an office with Jonah, and you can imagine that was an exciting experience, to say the least. But I'm also honored to be sitting next to two of the most impressive rising stars in American politics, in my opinion. We've had the chance to work with Senator Capri Cafaro, Senator Frank LaRose, a bipartisan team from Ohio who have not only bridged the divide on many issues, but have represented the potential of the next generation to make a difference. Currently, Senator Cafaro just recently finished her term after a distinguished career, is now an executive resident at American University, teaching and passing along the lessons she's learned to the next generation. And Senator LaRose is still very active in the Ohio legislature. And I'll say this because both of you can't say this. There are many political observers in Ohio who see both of them serving in higher office. So let's get to it. First, I think it'd be helpful for this audience to hear from both of you how you decided to get involved in public service. Where did that come from? And why did you ultimately decide to run for office? So maybe Senator Cafaro will start with you.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks, Stephen, for including me. It's always a pleasure to be with my former colleague, Senator LaRose, and thank you to Nexus for putting together this conference. It's an exciting time for all of us, and we have a lot of work to do, both at the state, the national, and the international level. I come from northeastern Ohio. And any of you who may have followed the most recent presidential election may have seen some of my communities on television. We are ground zero of the Rust Belt. Communities that were decimated by the loss of manufacturing jobs in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and that's basically when I was born. And so I had always heard about the good old days of the community in which I was born. 4 generations of my family are in Trumbull County, Ohio. And so I really recognized early on, I was pretty nerdy. I'm sure that does not shock anybody. I was a very nerdy kid. I was very interested in following along with current affairs and really trying to get tuned into my community. I always tell the story about how I made trading cards out of the 1987 Time magazine Who is Running for President primary edition, because I was that big of a nerd. So if you were questioning it, and I always watch C-SPAN too. So I got the nerd cred down. But the long and the short of it is that I recognized very early on that there was a connection and a possibility that between how government might be able to improve the lives of people. And so I don't consider myself a politician. I never considered myself a politician. I am a public servant first, and figuring out ways to utilize public policy to improve the lives of people. So I went on to represent Trumbull, Ashtabula, Northeastern Geauga counties, which way in Northeastern Ohio, the community that I was born in. And as I said, very much, had a history of economic decline, which was a huge motivating factor. I also had a personal motivating factor in my grandfather, and I'll talk, I think, later on about healthcare policy and why I got engaged in healthcare policy. But my grandfather was a World War II vet and a small business guy, and he was a huge inspiration to my entrance into public service as well. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's when I was in my late teens, and that actually turned my attention away from national security policy, which is where I thought I was going to go, into healthcare policy. And as a family caregiver, ultimately that shaped the kind of public servant I became, the policy issues in which I focused, and forced me to go back to school to get master's number 2 and become a licensed master's level social worker while I was minority leader. So that's just a little taste of our journey, and we all have our own journey. So,
Senator LaRose.
Yeah, so I think I came to the realization at a very young age that we all devote a lot of our time throughout our lives to these things called careers and what we do. And I made a promise to myself at a young age that I was going to do things I loved, do things I believed in, follow my passions, instead of just sort of always looking for what can earn me money. And so for me, that led me at first into service in the military. I did that for 10 years, had a great time, traveled around the world with the finest men and women I've ever known, and represented the country I love, which was a great opportunity. When I got out of the Army, I was sort of looking for that next thing. I remember the oath that I took in the Army is to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. That doesn't have an expiration date. That's a lifelong commitment. And I started looking toward running for public office, although that was what my heart was saying. My head was saying, take this business degree you have from Ohio State and go out in the world and earn a living. And I started trying to pursue that, but my heart won out. And so I decided to run for public office in 2010, and Senator Cafaro and I had the chance to serve together in the state Senate. I think what was ultimately behind this, though, was the sense that, like Senator Cafaro's family and like many of our families, my family came to this country looking for an opportunity. For us, it was about 100 years ago. We came from Sicily, and we were looking for a place where we can work hard and earn a living and provide for ourselves. And this country has blessed my family immensely, and I wanted to give back. I believe in public service, and that's why I decided to run for office.
And I think a lot of people here in the audience are driven by a variety of issues, and I'm sure, like many of you, we read the headlines, and we find so many reasons to be cynical. We see politics being too dysfunctional. We see millennials feeling disaffected from the process. We feel like our leaders are too corrupted. And yet, I often feel optimistic because I have the chance to work with leaders like you on the ground. And so some people often wonder why I'm smiling a lot of the time, while most people are pretty angry or frustrated with what's going on. One of the reasons why I get excited working with leaders like yourself is you don't see issues entirely through a partisan lens. And I think this is reflective of our generation, where we're not driven by left or right, we're driven by the issue, and much less so by party. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you reach consensus, because there are so many polarizing forces. There is the polarized media, there is the way that we draw districts, and we're going to touch on that later, the way that we finance campaigns, the way that we run our primaries. And is Ohio a closed primary? Yeah.
Only Republicans can vote.
Yeah.
Republicans.
Yeah.
Right, but you can pull a ballot.
Yeah.
When you can show up and pull a ballot.
Got it. Our primary system needs a lot of reform as well. So there are a lot of polarizing forces, and the opportunities for even building bipartisan relationships is certainly rare in Congress, but also sometimes rare in the state legislature. So, when you entered the state legislature, could you just bring us in kind of behind the scenes and share with us, how do you actually reach across the aisle? How do you build those relationships? How do you push against all of these polarizing forces? And maybe I'll start with you, Senator LaRose.
To me, it's second nature. And what was jarring to me was this contrast when I arrived in the state Senate, and I serve with good people, Republicans and Democrats, both sides. Most of the folks that we serve with are really excellent, dedicated public servants. But what was jarring to me was the different mentality from what I'd found in the military. What we had in the military was this sense that everybody has to work together to achieve a common goal. You put your differences aside and focus on the mission. When I arrived in state government, what I found was this sense that if I can make the other side look foolish, then I ought to devote my efforts to that. It's a very tribal sense that people bring to things, and it's even more pronounced, I think, at the federal level. It's this idea that I'm from the elephant tribe, and I must go to war every day with the members of the donkey tribe, and they are my sworn enemies. I just don't view the world that way. I think that there's a time for campaigning, and we work hard and try to get people with similar ideological makeup elected, but then once the campaigns are over, it's time to work together and govern, and that's what I've really enjoyed being able to do.
Excellent. And Senator Cafaro, you mentioned one of the issues that really drove you into public service was healthcare. And the Medicaid reform in Ohio, amazingly, was a bipartisan issue. You were one of the leaders on the issue in building bipartisan consensus. So maybe you can take us, in the room where you were actually working with Republican lawmakers on an issue that I know a lot of people in the audience care about. How did you actually reach consensus on that issue and move the ball forward on that?
Medicaid reform was very interesting because we had a Republican governor, John Kasich, who, was advocating for codifying Medicaid expansion. We had Republican-controlled chambers of the legislature that were a little bit less, committed to, signing on the dotted line for what they, perceived as Obamacare and extended entitlement, et cetera. We came together, myself, again, a licensed social worker, and my colleague, a Republican colleague of mine, who's still in the state Senate, Dave Burke, who's a pharmacist, from the opposite sides of the state, two different parties, but shared a common goal. And so we brought Democrats and Republicans together that were interested in trying to find a way to be able to meet the goal. And I think this is the important lesson to this. No one said, let's leave people out in the cold and not provide them with access to quality care. The question was, how do we actually execute and implement that policy to achieve that goal? And the big thing that we did, and I actually got blowback from my Democratic colleagues about it, is that one of the big things, and right now this is actually incredibly important because the Affordable Care Act is if nothing else, going to manifest itself in a different way coming forward in the future now with the quote-unquote repeal and replace. But our biggest concern was with Medicaid expansion, it was predicated on the fact that we're going to take on, basically younger working individuals into the Medicaid system. So you're increasing the eligibility threshold from an income perspective, but you're getting younger, healthier people in there and empowering them to be able to work by giving them access to health care. So the issue was, well, under the Affordable Care Act, you're going to get 100% of this money from the federal government. Republicans, and frankly myself included as a Democrat, said it's not free money. So we had to work together to identify a way, how do we continue to serve the Medicaid expansion population if the federal government walks away from the states and we no longer have, all of this federal money to support the community. So we looked at tangible, nonpartisan sources. We had actuaries, we had Ohio State come in, the Health Policy Institute of Ohio, and we really tried to bring together actual facts in order to move the ball forward. But it would not have been possible without our ability to actually have dual sponsorship. Prior to my tenure as the minority leader, we actually were not able to co-sponsor bills together as equitable dual sponsors. So the first thing I did when I came in as minority leader in 2009 was ask the president of the Senate, at the time, Bill Harris, to modify our rules to ensure that we were able to actually have dual sponsored bills. So all of this, going back and forth trying to find consensus, working towards a common goal by utilizing facts and staying away from the partisan hotbed, issues, wouldn't have even been possible for us to do had we not actually modified the rules of the chamber.
Right, and I think that got signed into law ultimately, right?
2013,
Yeah, in
yes.
2013.
And
Wow.
we actually are on target to support our Medicaid expansion population without the federal 97% match by 2019. But it's also predicated on a whole lot of modeling that I'm not going to get into, but that may fall apart at some point.
Excellent. That's impressive. Now, let me move to Senator LaRose. There's an issue that you've been working on that I've been very impressed with, and we referenced it earlier. It's the way that we draw our districts. And just a couple days ago, or was it yesterday, you announced a new bipartisan bill on this topic. And I feel like we're at a pivotal moment on the redistricting issue, moving from one that democracy nerds cared about to where today I think we see an emerging movement of young people who feel like the system is broken. This is one of the reasons it's broken. So Senator LaRose, can you just explain to us, why do we need to care about redistricting? What is the issue? What is the current state in Ohio? And then what are you proposing right now?
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite topics. Just like Senator Cafaro can talk all day about healthcare, so I'll try to keep it brief. First of all, what I want to explain is why redistricting matters and what can be done about it. And I fully recognize that this is kind of a wonky issue. We've got a 1-year-old in our house who has inherited her father's insomnia. And so a couple days ago, my wife was saying, all right, it's 11, it's your turn to go put her back to sleep. And I'm walking upstairs, and Lauren said, talk to her about redistricting. So I recognize, but here's why it's not boring. Here's why it matters. Redistricting paired with campaign finance and the polarization in the media is a great contributor to dysfunction in state capitals and in the U.S. Capitol. And here's why. Most of us who serve an elected office are in a district where we will automatically win on general election day because it's a Republican district and we're a Republican, or it's a Democratic district and we're a Democrat. And so what that means is that for the vast majority of people, both in U.S. Congress and in state capitals, is their only threat to their political survival is a primary. And Poli-Sci 101 is that when a Republican has a primary opponent, he or she goes to the far right. And when a Democrat has a primary opponent, he or she goes to the far left. That's how you survive primaries, because it's the party base, it's the hardcores that come out and vote in primary elections. The problem with that is it leaves nobody in the middle where the problems are actually solved. Most state legislatures, the U.S. Congress, has very few people like Senator Cafaro and me who are willing to reach across the aisle and work together, because you're abandoning your tribe when you do so, right? And so redistricting is something that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed on a state-by-state basis. Here's what we're doing about it in Ohio, or at least trying to do about it in Ohio. First of all, we were able to reform the way the lines are drawn for our state legislative districts through a vote of the people of Ohio a year and a half ago. 71% of Ohioans voted in favor of this, and almost no money was spent promoting it. It's just one of those issues that once people understand it, they support. The next step that we need to do, in the resolution I introduced, corrects the way that we draw congressional districts. My belief is, and some states have tried to create independent commissions, I don't think there's anybody that's really independent. I don't know where you're going to find a few dozen people that have absolutely no bias, that are going to sit in a room for weeks on end and draw district lines and not bring any political bias to the table. I think that it's a political process. You need to sort of acknowledge that and then force consensus. And so that's what our bill does, is it puts Republicans and Democrats, or whatever majority and minority is into the future, it puts the parties in a room and says, y'all work it out. Come to an agreement. Compromise, which is not a dirty word. Compromise is how statesmen and women solve problems, and work it out. That's what we're trying to accomplish in Ohio, and hopefully we can do it.
One reason why it's amazing that you're leading this is, I think if this passes and districts are drawn fairly, and because the current districts were drawn by Republicans, it would actually disadvantage your own party.
Yes and no, and that's why I say this is tough love for my party. I want to be a member of a party that wins elections because we have better ideas, better candidates, work harder, and win elections the honest way. I don't want to win elections by rigging the game.
One of my favorite books is John Kennedy's Profiles in Courage, and I think what you're seeing right here is an example of courage from both of our legislators. He talks about all of the different forces you have to respond to as a legislator. The force that I think you're responding to most are your principles and what's good for the people and not just for your party. And to build consensus is often the most difficult thing to do. It's the most courageous thing to do in a democracy, and both of you are doing it in extraordinary fashion. Please give a big round of applause to our state legislators, Senator Cafaro and Senator LaRose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen and senators.